Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and this is the podcast where we take a look at the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, and our general joy of being alive. And we also talk about sustainable things, and we talk about ways to make better cities and better living spaces for ourselves. And on that note, let me introduce you to Chelsey Jersak. Chelsey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm happy to be here.
Did I get your last name right? Jersak?
Yeah, that's
Is
great.
that Polish?
It's Czech, in fact.
It's Czech. Right on. Okay, so our grandparents were neighbors. Let's start by learning a bit about you. I always like to start that way. Tell us why you chose a career in urban planning. Actually, before you start, I should mention to people that Chelsey has created a company called Situate that helps companies to do urban infilling, which she's going to explain in a minute. And it's a beautiful, smart thing. So let's get this kicked off. Tell us how you chose a career in urban and regional planning, and then sort of walk us through the pathway that led you to the creation of Situate and your other initiative, Wello Living.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I first of all had no idea what urban planning was. Like many people, we grow up and we know what doctors are and nurses are, and some of us know what engineers are, not everyone. Dentists, we know all of these sort of typical career paths. I had never heard of urban planning. So when I graduated high school and I was thinking about what to do, I knew that I was interested in communities. I was interested in people and how people came together and lived together, but I didn't know what that would look like. And the closest match that I could find was archaeology. So that's where I started. I started studying archaeology, and after a bout of heat exhaustion, I decided that maybe that wasn't the path for me. So I was visiting some archaeological ruins in Mexico, and I realized that being outside all day in the sun was probably not the right move, for me and my, sort of Northern European background. And so I went back to the university catalog, back in the day when these things existed and there was a book and I could flip through it. And I looked for something else, something that would still, match with these interests that I had in people and in community and how people come together and settle and live together and figure that out. And I found city planning. And so I switched. I started studying city planning, and that I graduated from the University of Saskatchewan in their city planning program. And fast forward a couple of years, I found myself working for the city of Edmonton in the zoning bylaw team. So that was the time that I call the dawn of infill. It was back in the early 2010s, and infill was just starting to be on the tips of people's tongues. People were talking about it. People were trying to figure out, how can we do this? Is this something that we want to enable? And if so, how do we do that? So the answer was yes. And the first step at this time was to figure out, okay, how do we subdivide 50-foot lots? We have these large lots in some of our older neighborhoods. Maybe we could, subdivide them and put two houses where there used to be one. So this was at the very beginning. And so I was working on the team that was going to be doing these amendments to the zoning bylaw. And it was pretty logical to me. We strike out one number and we write in another number. And it ended up being really controversial. It was a really controversial change. And it was an eye-opening experience for me because I realized in that moment that this was actually a really big change. And there wasn't a lot of education around why we were doing it. Like, why was this important and what would be the impact? So I segued from working for the city to opening Situate, which is the company that I founded almost 10 years ago. So in 2016, I made that transition. And then the purpose of the company basically was, I realized firsthand that doing infill was really hard. There were people out there who wanted to do it, who wanted to, build a city where more people could live closer to amenities, all of the good things that we like to talk about, shops and services and schools and parks, but it was hard. So I opened the company to sort of support people through that process. And here we are almost 10 years later.
Forget the old paradigm that privacy means darkness. With Solera translucent glazings, architects can design spaces that are private, filled with natural light, and visually stunning. It's time to rethink how buildings work and feel. Learn more at advancedglazings.com.
So let's take a minute and define infill. Can you explain that process to us?
Absolutely. Infill is property redevelopment. So any kind of redevelopment within the existing or established area of the city is what I use the term infill for. So it's a really broad term. It can be all shapes and sizes. Some people think of it as very small scale, like skinny houses, or it can also be commercial. It can be a new corner store, new coffee shop going in into a neighborhood. It can also be, a new tower downtown, like that's infill as well. So it looks like all kinds of things, all shapes and sizes and all uses as well. But what it isn't is a new subdivision on the outskirts of the city, for example. So it would
Right.
be, something that's being redeveloped where there was already something else before.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I mean, every consequential city I've been to, even little cities, I live in a little city, and there's all kinds of spots where I'm going, that is a big lot right in the middle of town, very close to some very desirable things. Why is that not being, taken advantage of? Tell me, but before we move on and start to really understand Situate, what are the reasons that these empty spaces exist, that these, dilapidated buildings and empty lots, why are they there and why hasn't, somebody jumped on it already and redeveloped them? What
Yeah,
gets in the
it's
way?
it's complicated. I think there's a number of factors, and infill often takes place on underutilized or unutilized pieces of property throughout the city. So it might be that there's nothing there at all, or maybe it's a parking lot, which is quite common. And there was, maybe an old warehouse and it was taken down 50 years ago and nobody has redeveloped it. Or, there's instances where you have an old house that's at the end of its life cycle on a large lot. And so it's underutilized. And the house is no longer able to be repurposed or renovated. It's at the end of its lifespan. And so infill happens in either of those cases. Now, why it doesn't happen, there's a lot of factors I would say that go into that, both market factors and non-market factors. Market factors certainly are just, is there a demand for whatever it is that I build, whether that be housing, whether that be a commercial use. If I build it, people won't necessarily come. So I have to be pretty certain that they will. And other market factors are, cost of construction. Can I get the materials that I need? Are they going to be tariffed? There's a lot of uncertainty around these sorts of things from the market side of things. And then, of course, there's a lot of non-market barriers as well. The biggest one being planning and zoning regulations, of course. So we deal with, I think it's quite common across Canada, pretty restrictive zoning bylaws and zoning regulations that we have to navigate. So, if in order for me as a developer to be able to make a project work, I need to put 20 units on a lot, but the zoning only allows for 8, I'm stuck. I mean, there's nothing I can do there. So that's where a company like Situate comes in to say, okay, well, would it be reasonable here to rezone so that I can better utilize this land so that, we can have a win-win here. I can get the thing built that I want to build, and then there can be new neighbors perhaps in this neighborhood. The city can collect taxes from this new building, whereas right now they're probably not, or not collecting much. So there's a whole bunch of factors I think that have to come into place kind of align at the right time in order for construction to move forward.
Okay, so who is Situate's customer? Is it developers that you're working with to help them sort of navigate through this sort of bizarre process?
Yeah,
Sometimes bizarre
exactly.
process.
It can be bizarre. If not bizarre, it's certainly opaque and
Yeah.
confusing and time consuming and not the most fun way for most people to spend their time. So, yes, we work with private sector clients and I call them real estate entrepreneurs. So, that's the umbrella term that I give to them. So, those are builders, typically small and medium sized developers and investors. So, people that are engaging in infill either for the first time, maybe they haven't done it before, or maybe they've done it many times and they want to outsource that work, or maybe they're graduating into something larger scale, whereas before they were building eightplexes, now they're going to build a 4-story apartment building with a coffee shop on the main floor. So there's sort of different ways that people come to us, but that is our ideal client.
Okay. Before we go on, we should pause for a second here and answer the question. I know everybody probably knows the answer, but let's take a second and answer it. From a sustainability perspective, why is infill so important?
That's a really good question. And I think there's a lot of ways to answer it. Certainly, environmentally, traffic emissions account for a large amount of emissions that, are going out into the atmosphere, and that comes from driving around town. So the more that we build our cities and towns to require us to drive to get places, the more emissions are being emitted. So that's a really big one. If we can cut out some of those trips just by living like closer to stuff that we need, if we can walk to get groceries, if you have a little cart that you can take with you to put your milk and your bread in, that can cut down on a car trip. And that in and of itself makes a really big difference. So from my perspective, looking at the city as a system, which is typically what I do as an urban planner, that's a really important metric. I think we can talk about sustainability though in a lot of ways. And there's one thing we don't talk a lot about is maybe social sustainability, which is, if you read headlines these days, you see a lot about loneliness, and we're living through a loneliness epidemic. And this was the case before the pandemic, and it was exacerbated during the pandemic, and we haven't really recovered from it, And so I think that has a lot to do with how we build our cities and how we build our neighborhoods to sort of isolate ourselves and like separate uses so that rather than walking down the street and running into people, you got to get in your car and drive and go to some big box center to acquire all the things you need for the week and then go back to your house and probably, stay there most of the time. So we haven't really built the places that we live, our communities, to foster community or social sustainability. And so I think that's a part of the sustainability conversation as well.
Right. Okay. Brilliant answer. Thank you. Let's talk about the mechanics of how Situate actually works. Can you sort of, just go up to a high level and tell us the process of how a real estate entrepreneur works with you?
Sure. Yeah. We provide two main things. So, strategy on the one hand, so people come to us and with usually one of two questions. One, I have a piece of property that I have or that I'm interested in, and I'm not sure what I could do there. Help me figure that out. And so then we'll help them figure that out, and we provide something to them called a zoning analysis, which is basically, a feasibility study. Or they come to us and they say, I have a vision. I have something that I know that I want to accomplish on this property that I have or that I'm, going to be putting under contract. And I want to know if it's possible. I want you to tell me or like reassure me that I can do it. And so then we do the same thing. Basically, we give them a zoning analysis, which is a feasibility that like tests out various pathways of achieving their goal and if it's achievable or if it's not and what those pathways might look like in terms of risk. So everyone's risk tolerance is different. We could say, okay, this is possible, but you have only 50% chance, but we're willing to take it on because it's a really good project and we think it should get approved, but we can't, there's no guarantee that we can give to you. It might be an uphill battle. On the other hand, there might be something that perfectly aligns with policy that people want to do. And then we'll say, okay, there's no guarantees in real estate, but we think you have a very good chance. And so that would be a less risky pathway. So basically we map out potential pathways for achieving their goal, or we'll map out like various scenarios, redevelopment scenarios for that potential property. And that would be phase one. That's the strategy step. And then after that, we go into approvals. So if they decide to move forward, then we look at an approvals pathway, and that often is rezoning the land. So my example earlier was, okay, I need 20 units on this piece of property, for example, to make this project work, for me to be able to get financing for it, for my pro forma to function, but I can only get 8. Okay, I have 3 potential zones I could rezone to. Now I've chosen zone ABC. Now Situate is going to manage the approvals process for that. So we handle all of the neighbor relations, the government relations, the technical pieces. We coordinate any technical reports that are required. So we just go through the process and then we represent them at the city council public hearing.
The neighbor relations, that's interesting. What does that look like?
Yeah, so neighbor relations for us, what we do is we create a project webpage that's custom for the project, and then we put a sign on the property with the QR code and the URL to say, okay, this is what's happening here, this is why it's happening, this is when it's happening, this is who we are, and this is how you can contact us. This isn't common, but I really recommend it as a best practice because nobody likes being surprised. And when people don't know what's going on, the imagination takes over, And so we try
Yeah.
to just provide people with as much information as possible and provide them a means to acquire more information if they want it or they need it so that they have it. Our goal isn't to, convince or persuade people, but it is to just provide a contact, provide information so that they know what's going on and why it's happening. We send a mail out, like we do a postcard mail out to the surrounding landowners as well, so that they know what's going on. And then they also, get the link to our webpage, can contact us. And that provides a way for us to let people know what's going on, because people will always find out that something's happening, but it's very difficult to find out often what that thing is. The cities, like municipalities, will often send out notices, but I don't know, Joe, if you've ever received a notice from a municipality. Even I think sometimes our like property tax assessment notices are very hard to understand. It's not written in plain language. It's written in a very technical way often. And so basically we try to communicate. We do our best to communicate in plain language to say, this is what's happening here and this is why.
Yeah, I'm married to a lawyer, so it's like, here, can you read this? It's just not everybody has that advantage for sure.
Yeah, it's
Um,
hard.
yeah, very much so. And that service would be hugely appreciated. Let's talk about scaling. Okay. Like, let's talk about how we move this out of Edmonton. So you've mastered the art of pulling back the opaque veil of Edmonton's planning system. How applicable are the learnings from Edmonton when you start to move it to Calgary or to Regina or to Montreal, Ottawa, whatever? How universal are your current learnings going to be as you move to other cities?
It's a really good question. Every municipality has its own set of policies and bylaws. So every municipality will have its own zones, its own zoning bylaw, and like regulatory framework. That being said, there's a lot of commonalities. I mean, at the end of the day, the process is very similar within any Canadian municipality, as well as the process that we've developed. I mean, strategy and approvals applies everywhere. This is universal. This is what everybody needs, no matter where you're located. So figuring out what your strategy is and then going through the approvals process, these can be really, two very painful processes to have to navigate on your own. And so the process of navigating them is the same. The underlying technical documents are different, but at the same time, they're not so different. I mean, they regulate height, they regulate setbacks, they regulate floor area ratio. At the end of the day, everyone is doing the same thing, sometimes using slightly different terminology, but it's more or less universal the way that our system works across the country.
Right on. Okay. Well, what about when you get out of the country? Like, do you do any off camera for the people who weren't privy to the conversation before we started recording? Chelsey and I chatted a little bit about the fact that she spends a bit of her month in Mexico City. Have you done any work, like Situate work in Mexico City?
I haven't. I enjoy Mexico City as a resident, not as a professional. However, there is a really interesting Urban Land Institute community here. So I have been able to take some real estate tours and kind of learn about design and real estate and how it works in Mexico and in Mexico City in general. I think for anyone who hasn't visited the city, I really recommend it if you're interested in, cities, urbanism, design, architecture, anything in our world, really, anyone in our industry, because there is such an interesting design aesthetic and it's a constantly evolving city. So you see, on the topic of infill, you see a lot of infill at various scales and sizes and really interesting design choices being made, as well as a lot of heritage conservation as well. And so I think these two things in the most interesting cities coexist. We have infill, we have new buildings coming in existing neighborhoods, and then we have some really interesting sort of adaptive reuse projects as well. And Mexico has fantastic examples of these things, so highly recommend.
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Yeah, very much so. All right, let's change gears a little bit. You've got another initiative, really interesting initiative called Wello Living. Tell us, what Wello Living is, what you're trying to achieve, and how you plan to achieve those things.
Yes. So Wello is a project that I'm undertaking with a business partner, also an urban planner. incidentally. And we acquired a lot in Edmonton. And what we're doing is building I guess it's a small apartment building essentially for roommates and shared living scenarios. So basically, people who want to live together as friends and roommates in the city. So the concept is basically the building is a little cube. It looks from the front, it looks like a duplex, like a side by side duplex. So there's two front doors, and you open a door, and there's an upper unit, and then there's a basement suite. So basically, we have four upper units over top of four basement suites. The upper units all have three equal sized bedrooms and three ensuite bathrooms. So this is so that, when you're living with your friend or your roommate, you don't have to share a bathroom, you have your own bathroom, and you also don't have to fight over who's getting the master suite, who's getting the big bedroom that's designed for the
Right.
mom and the dad, with the big ensuite closet and the big bathroom, and then who's stuck in like the little 5-year-old kid room, because a lot of our housing is developed for the nuclear family, like with the nuclear family in mind, which is, two parents and two small children. And that's not necessarily how the majority of Canadians live anymore. And I think it's really interesting because according to Statistics Canada, from 2001 to 2021, roommate households grew by 54%. So this is the fastest growing household type in Canada's roommate households. But you wouldn't necessarily know that from looking around and looking at, new homes that are being built. So we are building something for our future selves, essentially. So for me, it's the golden girl scenario that I hope to someday live in.
I like it. So, roommates, is the assumption that these people know each other, don't know each other? Is it single lease? Do they all have individual leases? How does that work, Chelsey?
It's a really good question. So under the Edmonton zoning bylaw, if we were leasing each bedroom separately, it would be considered a lodging house. And this is, every municipality is going to have different regulations around this. So certainly something to be really careful about. So, like, do your due diligence in the strategy step, when you're thinking about doing something like this, make sure you understand the implications. But in Edmonton, where we're undertaking this project, we are ensuring that each of the units is a dwelling unit. So it can be like our target market is for friends and roommates. However, that's not exclusively who could live there. Like, certainly a family could live there, or, a single person could live there. It's just a 3-bedroom unit. And what makes it different from a design perspective is really the bedrooms and the bathrooms. So those are all equal size. You can share. Could you use one of them as an office if you wanted to, or just a spare bedroom? Of course, that's absolutely possible. But it is designed as a contained dwelling unit with 3 bedrooms, not 3 sort of dorm style rooms that you would rent individually and then be living with strangers. So we are expecting that people would be leasing this as a unit. We wouldn't be leasing each individual bedroom separately.
Okay. Do you think there are any municipalities where it would make sense to lease separately? Have you gone far enough afoot and done enough research across Canada to get a feel for that?
Absolutely. I think even within municipalities, there's a need for that kind of housing type. I think it's a very important housing type, especially for, students, younger people around post-secondary institutions. It's certainly, a necessary and needed housing form. It's just not the need that we chose to meet. The need that we're choosing to meet is this kind of, maybe you're not fresh out of high school, living outside of home for the first time. This is a choice that you're making. It's really a lifestyle choice. So, perhaps I would choose to live, like, personally for me, I might choose to live with friends as a way to save money on meals so that I can travel more, so that I'm not spending all of my income monthly on rent. There's a lot of reasons why people might choose to live with other people rather than living alone.
Do you think Canada's there culturally? Is there any sort of cultural adjustment that needs to be made, or are we ready for this already at this moment?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think the fact that roommate households have grown so drastically, over the last 25 years, over 50% growth in roommate households, I think says a lot. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It's not just that we're suddenly looking for solutions to the loneliness epidemic. Maybe we are to a certain extent, but also housing during this time frame has become much more expensive as well. And so I think we need to be cognizant that, living alone or acquiring a house in our 20s, the way that previous generations may have done, isn't so accessible now. It's not such an option. And so how do we provide housing for people that's still high quality, that's still well designed? I think people really want that. People want and desire to live in new housing with 10-foot ceilings and not living in a crowded basement suite that smells like mold. So I think there is a need for high quality, well designed housing that's also attainable.
What barriers do you see to scaling this concept? Do you see anything, consequential getting in the way of doing more of what Wello is doing?
It's going to really come down to individual zoning bylaws, municipality to municipality. Edmonton has a very progressive zoning bylaw compared to a lot of other municipalities in Canada. So, we're able to, due to the size of our lot, we're able to put 8 units on a lot that had 1 house on it before. So that makes a project like this viable. Whereas in a lot of other places, it might not be. And so that's really important. I think making sure that zoning and advocating for progressive zoning is really important. It's not easy. It takes time, but it's something that I think Canadians across the country need to be involved with because that's what makes the biggest difference. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay. No, that's fine. All right. We're coming to the end, Chelsey. And there's a question that I ask every guest, okay? And I tell the guests to answer from whatever perspective they'd like, okay? So here we go. What makes a great building?
Oh, it's a really good question. Often I think about communities or collections of buildings. So I think a good collection of buildings, so to speak, would be a place where people can needs by walking around. So this is a very city plannery answer. So I can live, I can socialize, I can go to a restaurant, I can get my groceries within a collection of buildings within, easy walking distance for me. And I think that is a really important goal for us.
I love it. Absolutely. All right. Before we go, do you have any exciting news that you'd like to share? Any events coming up or anything that you'd like to promote, Chelsey?
Our company, Situate, turns 10 next year, so we're going to be celebrating. There's a few things that we're doing. One, I will make a maybe soft announcement, is in celebration, we're actually planning a infill tour to Mexico City. So if anyone is interested in visiting the city and sort of looking at infill and urban redevelopment through a really interesting lens, that would be something to stay tuned for. So that's coming up in fall of 2026. Our webpage or our newsletter would be the best way to stay up to date about that. So you can visit us at situateinc.ca.
Situateinc.ca. How about Wello? Do you have a website for Wello as well?
We do.
Okay.
Yep.
And what's that?
welloliving.ca.
WELLO living.ca.
Correct.
Perfect. Chelsey, thank you so much. I learned a whole lot. There was a bunch of stuff there that I had no idea about. My gosh, I wish you the very best of luck on both projects, especially the infill project. I feel really keen about that. I feel very keen about what you're doing with Wello as well. But the infill project, like I say, every city I've been to, I've seen places that's like, there's something, it just doesn't make any sense to leave this space the way it is. So I commend you. I salute you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Joe.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.